When you think of America's greatest car thief of all time, you might think of Al Capone, the notorious crime boss who co-founded the Chicago outfit. Or maybe you can imagine a mastermind who pulled off a daring heist with a fleet of exotic cars. But the truth is more surprising. The most prolific car thief in US history is Min Jin Yang, who stole over 1,000 vehicles in his career. How did he do it? And why did he target the fanciest and most luxurious cars, such as Audis and Lamborghinis in New York? Keep watching to find out. New York City, the Big Apple, is a place where dreams are made and fortunes amassed. Some studies even describe it as the most luxurious city on Earth. It's a metropolis overflowing with the wealthy elite cruising its streets in their lavish top-of-the-line cars. In fact, it boasts America's highest concentration of high-end automobiles. But in 1999, a storm hit the city. New York City witnessed a wave of car thefts like no other. In less than a month and a half, 48 high-end vehicles vanished into thin air. It wasn't your typical smash-and-grab operation, no. These thefts were like a magician's vanishing act, swift and silent. It was as slick as their stolen rides. These thieves were smooth operators. They'd glide in, steal a car quicker than you can finish coffee, and vanish into the cityscape. No specific neighborhood was safe from their heists. Malls, parking lots, you name it. They were there, pulling off these disappearing acts. What set this case apart was the worrying fact that these stolen cars didn't reappear on the scene. Now, when the average car thief strikes, there's usually a silver lining for the police. You know how cops usually catch a whiff of a stolen car sooner or later? Well, not with this crew. The police were scratching their heads in confusion. Where on earth were these thieves hoarding their loot? Was there a secret underground garage teeming with luxury vehicles? Perhaps an auction house was secretly held for the rich and famous. The authorities were baffled. At first, they thought the missing cars were being smuggled out of the country. But how? Well, there was one place that could serve as a secret gateway for such a grand operation: the Port of Brooklyn. It is an ideal hub to ship out a treasure trove of stolen cars. So, a crack team from the NYPD's car theft unit decided to snoop around Brooklyn's port, thinking they might catch a car theft gang red-handed. But guess what? They didn't spot any suspicious activity. No gang, no expensive cars disappearing into the night. The shocking thing was that the mastermind behind this operation wasn't your typical New Yorker, or even an American, for that matter. This person went by the name Min Jin Yang, and he was from China. Min Jin Yang was the mastermind pulling the strings behind the theft of thousands of luxury cars, right under the Big Apple's nose. The value of all the cars he stole was around $40 million, which is around $75 million in today's value. The burning question on everyone's mind is, how on earth did he pull this off? To answer that question, we need to find out who Min Jin Yang is. Yang wasn't just any ordinary guy. He had a rather fascinating background. Before he started his car-stealing escapades, Min Jin Yang served as an intelligence officer in the Chinese army. After a rather unceremonious exit, Yang packed his bags and moved to Shanghai, one of China's most dazzling cities, where luxury was the name of the game. There, the demand for top-tier cars was sky-high, but the supply was about as scarce as a unicorn in Times Square. Luxury cars were practically an endangered species in China. So what did Yang decide to do? Well, he did what any self-respecting ex-intelligence officer would. He put his skills to use. He embarked on a career that would make any car enthusiast's jaw drop. Yang saw a golden opportunity and decided to make his move. He reached out to the shady underworld of Shanghai, where he presented a brilliant proposition for the head honcho of one of these notorious gangs. Yang painted a clear picture for the gang leader. He told this kingpin that he had a history as an intelligence officer in the army, and he knew a thing or two about the art of smuggling, the ins and outs, the hows and whys, and even how to outsmart the security forces. Miraculously, Yang managed to convince this gang leader that he could be their ticket to imported cars. He promised to bring vehicles from far and wide, and the gang leader would have the perfect setup to sell them in China through his well-established network. Why did the gang leader take the bait? Well, cars in China aren't exactly pocket change, and Yang could bring a car for $100,000 and sell it in China for a whopping $200,000. That's a 100% profit. The gang leader was all in. He liked the idea, and it's no wonder given the potential for massive profits. So, Yang and the gang leader shook hands on a 40-60 profit-sharing arrangement. and the gang leader handed Yang a cool $500,000 to kickstart their operations. Where did Yang decide to set up shop? The City of Dreams, New York. Yang was well aware that the Big Apple was the ideal hunting ground. It's a melting pot of luxury cars due to the abundance of wealthy folks in town. Armed with that generous investment, he headed to New York to turn his grand plan into reality. And here's where things get interesting. Yang didn't just stroll into the city. He applied his military training like a pro. He assumed a fake identity and went by the name Kenny, playing the role of an immigrant just trying to make ends meet. This was just the beginning of his mission to blend into American society. He wasn't aiming for the spotlight. In fact, he wanted folks to believe he was as ordinary as your next-door neighbor. So, he moved around town in an old Nissan Altima. No flashy rides here. He didn't want to come off as some silver spoon-fed rich kid. First, Yang got a sidekick, a right hand, man named Poi Chow. Poi Chow had been in the city and knew his way around. These two had a mission, finding the perfect hideout for the luxurious cars they were about to steal. But this wasn't just any hideout. It had to meet some specific criteria. First and foremost, it had to be far, far away from any nosy police station. Second, it had to be nestled in a quiet corner of town, preferably where there weren't too many problems or crimes going down. You know, the kind of place where cops and security forces don't exactly throw parties. Finding a hidden, squeaky clean spot in New York, a city known for its thriving crime rates, wasn't a walk in Central Park. After weeks of research, Yang and Chow finally struck gold. They located the ideal warehouse. Now all they needed to do was rent it, but they didn't want their names plastered all over the lease. So they cooked up a plan and created an anonymous company. The idea was simple. If anyone decided to investigate this ghost company, it wouldn't lead them back to Yang. He was covering his tracks, just in case things took a bad turn. But the plan was still far from being a wrap. Yang needed a team, a crew of trusty individuals, to pull this off. He handpicked fellow Chinese compadres for this gig. Why? Because they were the only ones he could trust implicitly, the ones whose loyalty he was dead certain about. Their first mission inside the warehouse was to make it look like a giant food pantry. They hauled in boxes of chow and neatly stacked them at the front, so that if anyone so much as peeked inside the place, they'd immediately think it was owned by some food company. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and in Yang's case, it was a craving for an amazing life that led to a plan so audacious it could make your head spin. Yang and his crew were about to embark on a journey that involved heists, surveillance, and a quest for the perfect partner in crime. It all began with food. Surprisingly enough, most of the food they bought for this adventure was dry and non-perishable. Why? Well, that's because they needed to keep it stashed in the refrigerator for an extended period. But the food was just the tip of the iceberg. These folks weren't playing games. They meant business. They installed surveillance cameras around their secret warehouse hideout, making sure that every nook and cranny of the street was under their watchful gaze. With the initial setup in place, Yang and his gang were ready to move on to the next phase of their grand plan, stealing cars. Now, here's where things get interesting. Yang was no car thief. He had no experience in stealing cars. Plus, he didn't want to get his hands dirty. He wanted to keep a low profile, stay in the shadows, and let others handle the dirty work. So, his idea was to find an expert in the field, someone who could do the dirty work for him. So he set out on a mission, visiting car garages and attending car auctions, hoping to find the right person. After a considerable amount of searching, he finally found his guy, a car thief extraordinaire named Dean. Their paths crossed at an auction for salvage vehicles. Yang wasted no time in laying out his proposition to Dean. He wanted Dean to be the man behind the wheel, quite literally. Dean would handle the theft operations, either doing the job himself or hiring skilled accomplices. Dean had the connections. He had a close friend in the business, a guy named Mario Lopez, who was as sharp as they come in the car theft game. Dean trusted Mario implicitly, and Mario was even better than Dean at swiping cars. For car thieves, the most challenging part isn't necessarily stealing the car itself. It's getting rid of the darn thing afterward. But with Yang offering to purchase any stolen car, the operation suddenly became a whole lot smoother. It was a tempting offer for Mario. Dean was all set to dive into the action, and so was Mario. But this wasn't a solo operation for him. No, he didn't go all Vin Diesel and steal cars by himself. Instead, Mario had a tricky approach. He'd stroll up to the chosen target car and disable the car's security system. Once Mario's done his thing, they rope in another player, someone who's skilled in the art of vanishing with stolen cars. This person takes the cars to a secret hiding spot. So we've got a chain of people involved, with Yang being the master puppeteer. Yang deals with Dean deals with Mario, and Mario gets the cars ready for a disappearing act. It's like a criminal relay race, but that's not all. Yang's has a warehouse where all these stolen gems are polished up before being shipped off to unknown destinations. And here's the twist. Everyone in the warehouse crew is Chinese or at least Asian, because Yang trusts them implicitly. It's a smart move. This way, Yang keeps his hands clean and his secrets hidden from prying eyes. When all the gears are in place, it's Yang's call. He tells Dean to kickstart the operation, and they have a specific type of car in their plans, only the fanciest of vehicles. Dean then passes the word to Mario, and it's go time. They hit up places where the rich folks hang out, posh malls, upscale neighborhoods, and, you won't believe it, even parking lots. Now, the whole operation rests on Mario's skills. This guy's a car-stealing professional. He can snatch any car, anytime, anywhere. When he locks onto his target, he doesn't mess with breaking the locks. That's too risky. Instead, he's all about smashing and slipping through the car window. See, if you break the car lock, the car's anti-theft computer goes into a fit, and the car won't budge an inch. One of Mario's superpowers, he's a tech whiz. He can outsmart the car's security systems with a super skill of ones and zeros. He hooks up the laptop to the car's computer like a pro, and with a few keystrokes, he reprogrammed it. This little trick transformed the car into something you could start with just a regular key, no fancy remote needed. Mario had this down to a science, and he could work his magic in under a minute. Once the car's security systems were toast, he'd give the nod to one of his crew members. "Hey buddy, take this beauty to a safe spot," Mario would say. And off the stolen car went. They had a secret spot, a parking lot in a rich neighborhood filled with more luxury cars than you could count. Why this luxurious location, you ask? Well, because Mario was no rookie. He knew that high-end cars often came equipped with GPS devices. Since Yang, the brains behind this operation, left no stone unturned, he gave his thieves strict orders. They'd drive those stolen vehicles to these fancy parking lots, then work their electronic magic, disabling the GPS. But what if, just what if, the owner had already figured out their precious ride was missing and decided to hit the panic button on that GPS? Well, Yang had that scenario covered too. The thief would drop off the car in one of these upscale lots, park among other flashy rides, and simply walk away. In the presence of other luxurious cars, their stolen cars blended in like chameleons at a rainbow convention. For good measure, they'd leave the car there for 2 days. 2 days served as the ultimate litmus test. If the car sat undisturbed for that long, it meant the cops were in the dark. They weren't out hunting for it and are clueless about its whereabouts. After 2 days, the thief makes his moves. He sneaks back to the car, confident that no one's tailing him. You see, all this was part of Yang's master plan. This guy wasn't just your regular crook. He had some serious intel. He had Dean, one of his trusted crew members, under his thumb. Dean, along with his buddy Mario, was in charge of the gang of thieves. Yang had a knack for playing it safe. He'd direct Dean to assemble a group of seasoned thieves and instruct them to park the car a few blocks away from a mysterious warehouse. Why all the secrecy? Well, Yang was a master of discretion. He didn't want a soul on this planet to have the slightest clue about the warehouse's location. Nobody except for Dean and his pal Mario, who had the hefty responsibility of managing this team of crafty criminals. After the thief skillfully parks the car, a safe distance from the warehouse, Dean enters the scene. He stealthily retrieves the vehicle and heads toward the mysterious warehouse. But Yang, being the strategic genius he is, isn't done testing the waters just yet. He wants to ensure that the police are nowhere near, tailing their prized possession. So, what's his grand plan? Yang instructs Dean to drive in circles around the warehouse. Why, you ask? Well, it's pretty simple. If any vehicle happens to join Dean's little parade, it's a dead giveaway that someone is hot on their tail. Yang had a two-pronged approach to stay ahead of the law. First, there were the surveillance cameras discreetly perched outside the warehouse. They're like the silent sentinels, keeping an eye on the street, ready to spot any car snooping around after Dean. But Yang wasn't one to rely on just a single trick. There was another layer to this operation. Yang had a master plan, and he knew that timing was everything. His 13-second strategy too wasn't about speed, it was about precision. And that's what made his heists legendary. Yang's crew had not one but two getaway cars in play. One car was ready to whisk them away at a moment's notice. The second car circled a wider area, staying on high alert, just in case the police were trailing the stolen vehicle. When Yang felt the coast was clear, and there was no danger, he signaled to bring the loot-laden vehicle back to the safety of their secret warehouse. Inside the warehouse, Yang had a team of experts, and they were all about preserving the integrity of the stolen goods. They treated the vehicles like delicate works of art, aiming to make them appear fresh off the showroom floor. The Chinese team took charge of this crucial stage. They examined the vehicles with a fine-tooth comb, fixed any issues, repaired locks, created new keys, and reprogrammed the car's computer. Once the Chinese crew finished their magic, it was time to get the show on the road, but not in a straightforward way. Yang didn't want the authorities sniffing around the ports and containers. They were getting smarter, especially with the rise in heists. They loaded those beauties into containers they'd brought themselves. To avoid raising eyebrows, they had to match the weight on the manifest with what was inside. So, what did they claim was in those containers? Food. Yep, they went as far as making sure the weight of the imaginary food matched the real cars. But that's not all. They created fake manifests for the shipment, cunningly listing the contents as food. This was a heist, not a comedy show. There was no room for mistakes. Now you might think they'd send the container straight to the nearest port. Well, not in Yang's playbook. He knew the heat was on, and the cops were itching to arrest him. So, he made a power move. Instead of playing it safe and heading to the nearest port, they shipped those pricey cars from the farthest one. Yang was playing chess, while everyone else was playing checkers. To get the job done, they'd start by sneaking their loot into a container. Now they didn't want to keep it too close to home, so they shipped it off to New Jersey. For those not well-versed in US geography, that's just a stone's throw away from the hustle and bustle of New York City. But they didn't stop there. They'd load that container onto a train moving across the country. From the bustling East Coast to the far-flung West Coast in California, they were covering some serious ground. Yang wasn't just out to avoid the local police. He had his sights set on California's ports. Why California? Well, it's a lot closer to China, which is Yang's ultimate destination. You see, California sits right on the western edge of the US, making it a convenient gateway to the east. It's a two-birds-one-stone kind of deal, dodging the authorities and getting closer to the bustling markets of China. Now, when the container reaches one of California's ports, it's just another food container. Nothing to raise eyebrows. But here's where the magic happens. The ship isn't bound for China. Nope, it's going in another direction. But hold on, they've got another trick up their sleeves. Midway through the journey, they meet another ship in the middle of the ocean. You know what they do? They secretly transfer the container to the second ship, which is bound for China. What's more, the folks running the second ship are in on the secret. They know exactly what's in that container, and they even have a manifest with all the details of the cars inside. So, Yang and his gang ran this operation for a solid 5 years. In that time, they managed to swipe thousands of cars from the streets of New York, leaving the police scratching their heads. Yang's gang remained elusive despite the staggering number of stolen cars and the millions they made. Now, you might think the demand for these hot cars would cool off, but it was quite the opposite. China couldn't get enough of them, putting pressure on Yang to up the ante. Yang and his gang were struggling to keep up with the demand, so they decided to take things up a notch. They turned their sights to car dealerships. The perfect place to nab several cars at once. What's better than stealing one car? How about several in one go? One of Yang's henchmen, Mario, went undercover as a potential customer at a dealership. He was there for a test drive, but not the kind you're thinking of. He was there to get details. While chatting with the salesman, Mario was monitoring the layout of the shop. He noticed the sneaky spot where the car keys were stashed. A box securely fixed to the wall within the manager's office. With a sly nod of gratitude to the unsuspecting salesman, he left. A few days later, Mario and his gang returned to the dealership after closing hours. Like a mastermind, he quietly broke in, his sights set squarely on the manager's office. or more precisely, the treasure chest of car keys. Inside that unassuming box lay the keys to a dazzling collection of luxury cars. And outside, in the shadows, his loyal crew waited patiently, ready to spring into action at his signal. Mario gave the nod, and like a perfectly orchestrated symphony, 7 of them entered the scene. Each of his accomplices grabbed a set of keys, and they drove off in different directions. The entire operation happened with breathtaking efficiency, taking a mere 3 minutes from start to finish. By the time the alarm system sounded and sent an electronic SOS to the police, Mario and his friends were already fading into the night, leaving only tire tracks in their wake. It was a heist so swift and well executed that it seemed almost otherworldly. But, as fate would have it, one of the 7 stolen cars had an accident. When the police reached the scene of the accident, they were surprised to discover that the wrecked vehicle was, in fact, a stolen one. The unlucky thief found himself in handcuffs and underwent a thorough grilling by the relentless investigators. Following some persuasive police tactics, this newfound captive began to sing. He spilled the beans on the entire operation. Mario and Dean, the architects of this grand heist, were in the spotlight. The police decided it was high time to track down Dean. The unlucky thief had told the police that Dean was the mastermind behind the car theft operation. Armed with this info, they assembled a team of investigators and set them on Dean's trail. These officers went to great lengths to follow Dean, and after some time, Dean unknowingly led them to Yang's warehouse, but the police weren't about to bust through the front door. Instead, they parked their cars a safe distance away and settled in for a good old-fashioned stakeout, hoping to uncover the secrets hidden within the warehouse's walls. But Yang had an ace up his sleeve in the form of his old buddy Chow. Chow was no stranger to keeping an eye on things, and he immediately spotted those nosy investigators and their parked cars. Yang, well prepared and unshaken by the situation, had organized his warehouse to be the ultimate disappearing act. While the investigators gathered intel, Yang kept his cool and refrained from bringing any new cars into the warehouse. But the place still housed some valuable wheels, along with tools for fixing them. So what's a crafty criminal to do? Yang hatched a plan to move everything out without raising suspicion. To throw the police off the scent, Yang brought in a few trucks, seemingly loaded with food. You see, the investigators assumed they were staking out a food warehouse, not a den of thieves. Yang played it cool, and, right under their noses, loaded up all his cars and equipment, blending in with the innocent hustle and bustle of a supposed food transport operation. The next day, when the police returned for round 2 of surveillance, they were in for a surprise. The warehouse looked just as it did the day before, and to their bafflement, it seemed like no one had entered or left. Yang had pulled off an ingenious disappearing act, leaving the investigators scratching their heads. They were taken by surprise, and that was the moment they said, "Let's make a move." They decided to break in and search the place for evidence, but they came up empty-handed. The gang had outsmarted them during the surveillance, leaving the investigators scratching their heads. You see, the elusive Yang had been playing a game of hide-and-seek, refusing to make a grand entrance in front of the determined detectives. To add to their troubles, they didn't have a clue what this mysterious character looked like. So, where did they turn? Well, back to an old acquaintance they knew well, Dean. At first, they contemplated arresting Dean, but cooler heads prevailed. Instead, they opted to keep Dean under a watchful eye yet again. They had their fingers crossed, hoping to nab the entire gang or, at the very least, the lion's share. Their quest wasn't just about catching the culprits. They also wanted to discover the whereabouts of those missing cars. The investigators decided to take it up a notch. They sought permission from the court to eavesdrop on Dean's phone conversations. What did they discover? Well, it seemed like a broken record. Call after call, the same questions cropped up. Are the agents still keeping tabs? Did they put a stop to the surveillance? When are they coming back? Dean's replies were almost comically consistent. I don't know. It was clear to the investigators that these inquisitive voices on the other end were likely Dean's partners in crime. After 6 long months of surveillance, a key player entered the scene, a certain Kenny. Kenny had news for Dean, news of an order for 260, but he didn't exactly spill the beans on what this 260 meant. Kenny's words were cryptic, as if he knew he was being watched. This raised red flags for the investigators. They suspected that Kenny could be the elusive gang leader, and that the gang might be gearing up for another round of thievery. What the investigators didn't know was that Yang was genuinely paranoid about phone surveillance. He communicated in coded language to avoid detection, switching phones at intervals and disposing of them, rendering their tracking efforts increasingly complicated. To further complicate matters, he instructed his gang members to frequently change their phones, making it even more challenging for investigators to keep up, as they required court approval for wiretapping each new phone number. The investigators had their work cut out for them. Getting court approvals for phone surveillance was just the tip of the iceberg in their relentless pursuit of cracking this case. Every time one of these shady characters switched phones, the investigators were on high alert. How'd they stay in the loop? Turns out, they were still tapping into their family connections. Like take Dean, he used to ring up his missus. So even when he got a new phone, they'd sniff out his new digits through his wife's calls. Once they nailed Dean's new number, it was like a green light for a whole snooping spree. They got the court's blessing to continue eavesdropping on him. Through his chats with his partners in crime, they unraveled this whole web of numbers. It was a long, exhausting process, but it paid off big time. The investigators were banking on hitting the jackpot. For the first time in this wild tale, the detectives weren't playing catch-up. And to make matters worse for the big boss, Yang, his crew wasn't as slick as he was. His bud Chow, for instance, was blabbing about dinner spots on the phone like it was no big deal. That made it easier to tail them. The investigators milked that info, sending an undercover Chinese officer to the restaurant where Chow and Yang met. Finally, they got a close-up of the mastermind they'd been chasing for years. And the planted officer, he got the lowdown on a new warehouse these crooks were eyeing. The cops set up a whole surveillance gig. No flashing lights or sirens. They were slicker. They planted cameras and GPS trackers on containers heading to that dodgy warehouse. These guys were stepping up their game. It was a whole new ball game, and the cops were calling the shots. Meanwhile, Yang, oblivious, kept hustling, bringing in new wheels and brainstorming new ways to steal. Little did he know, the tables had turned and the cops were playing chess, while he was stuck playing checkers. Because of the blowback from the heist on the car dealership, the gang moved to garages. Stealing cars from parking garages might not seem like the smartest way to go about a heist, but Yang and his gang had a plan that proved otherwise. In some parking garages, car owners trust the guard with their keys so he can move their vehicles if needed. It's a bit like a car ballet, with the guard as the conductor. Mario Lopez, Dean's friend, a member of this cunning gang, had a bright idea. He approached one of these parking garage guards with an offer that was hard to refuse: $500 for each car they allowed the gang to steal. To put this into perspective, it was like tempting a hungry fox with a juicy chicken. The guard's salary wasn't exactly making him rich, so the guard bit the bait, and the gang got a green light to go on a car-stealing spree. They set up a secret meeting with the guard, promising to keep their end of the deal. Little did he know, they had other plans for him. When the guard showed up for the rendezvous, they swiftly took his keys, tied him up, and left him inside the garage. Why, you ask? Well, it was a clever move to make sure no one suspected his involvement. This way, if anyone stumbled upon a tied-up guard, they'd think it was a classic case of a bad day at work. The gang then revved up the engines of the luxurious cars and zoomed out of the garage, leaving behind the immobilized guard. But, as with all heists, the story didn't end there. Shortly after, someone discovered the tied-up guard and, naturally, called the police. By the time the cops arrived at the scene, the stolen cars were safely tucked away in their secret hideout. However, hold on to your seatbelts. This heist had a twist coming. Remember when I said these thieves waited a couple of days after stealing a car to make sure no one was on their tail? Well, it appears they got a bit too comfortable in their criminal endeavors. Perhaps it was the high of successful heists, too much pressure from China, or maybe just pure recklessness. In any case, they didn't wait this time. They drove the stolen cars directly to their warehouse, oblivious to the fact that one of these luxury vehicles might have been equipped with a GPS tracking device. The police had been tipped off by one of the car owners, who noticed their missing ride and decided to play detective. Unfortunately, a local police officer unknowingly enters the scene. He had no idea that an investigation was in progress, or that the biggest car theft gang in all of America was right under his nose. He simply followed the GPS signal and found himself standing at the gang's secret lair. Meanwhile, The investigators were frantically watching the surveillance cameras on the other side. They realized their grand operation was on the verge of being exposed. The officer's presence threatened to bring the curtain down on their carefully orchestrated heist. As the police officer approached the warehouse, a rather unexpected twist occurred. The workers who had been tucked away inside suddenly burst out, running as if their lives depended on it. You can bet your bottom dollar they must have spotted the officer on their surveillance cameras. Now, as the investigators caught sight of this unexpected escape, it was clear they had to move fast. This was their golden opportunity to swoop in and apprehend the gang. No second chances here. In a flash, they rounded up the workers who had just vacated the warehouse. However, Yang, known as Kenny to his buddies, was conspicuously absent from the roundup. The investigators knew he'd vanish into thin air if he got wind of their bust. Thankfully, they have a surveillance unit that has been quietly keeping tabs on Yang's residence for some time. They'd been snooping around and had pinpointed the location of his hideout. The police had eyes on him from a safe distance, and as soon as the warehouse workers were safely in cuffs, they gave the green light to pounce. The showdown with Kenny went down that very night, when he casually strolled out of his front door. After intense questioning, it was revealed that his real name wasn't Kenny, but Minjin Yang. It turned out that he had a background in military intelligence within the Chinese army. No wonder he had outfoxed them for so long. However, one crucial piece of the puzzle remained unsolved. The police couldn't figure out where all those stolen cars ended up. The raid had been executed earlier than planned, leaving them high and dry on that front. They had no clue where these vehicles were being shipped off to, or where they were finding their new owners. In a surprising turn of events, Yang eventually admitted to enterprise corruption. The odd part was, they couldn't slap him with car theft charges, because, as it turned out, he wasn't the one physically swiping the vehicles. Despite all the chaos, Yang ended up with a mere 10-year sentence, even though he'd managed to make off with thousands of cars over the past decade. Experts estimated his ill-gotten gains to be worth a staggering $40 million, which today would be roughly $75 million. That's some serious cash, but the police never saw a single red cent of it. Yang had stashed his fortune in China, and it seemed he had outsmarted law enforcement in the end. In the grand scheme of things, Yang became the tricky victor in this game of cat and mouse with the police. His one slip-up didn't quite seal his fate, and he walked away with his ill-gotten fortune. If you found this video intriguing, click the link on your screen to explore other amazing videos.